When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
All right, hello YouTube. Welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. Today's video, we are going to be getting back to our Blackfyre Rebellion series. Now, again, I think it's really hard to kind of do this from a narrative point of view of going through every single event. So from here on out, until we really get to where the Blackfyre Rebellion starts, we're going to kind of take this story from the perspective of each of our main characters. And so by the title, this one's going to be about Aegon IV. We're going to cover most of his reign. We're going to cover kind of his perspective of events happening before he became king. And then we'll kind of go to other characters. So I think the next one will naturally probably be Nerys and also Aemon, telling like how they got to this point and some of the kind of stuff going on between the Daeron faction and also the Aegon IV faction, which will be central to the conflict going on, and we'll kind of go forward as the story unravels. But before we get into the video, if you guys did want to become a Patreon or a member, you do get videos early. As soon as I drop them and upload them to YouTube, you get them. And I also do give exclusive videos to those people. So thank you for those people that are on there. So let's get into it. So Aegon IV is born in 135 AC. Now, here is the really weird part about his birth. His father, Viserys Targaryen, the youngest son of Rhaenyra Targaryen, he was only 13 years of age when Aegon was born. And so there's a lot to unpack with that, because you're not ready to have a child at 13 years old. And so when you take this character of Viserys, who is the father of Viserys II, if you don't know, is the father of Aegon IV, he's only 13. How would you deal with having a son or a child at 13 years old? So when Aegon is born, he doesn't really have like a father figure. He almost has like a older brother figure. There's a 13-year gap that's much closer to like a brother than it is to a parent. And so that already is a incredibly weird dynamic between Viserys and Aegon. And then when it gets even weirder, and which makes Aegon's situation as a young kid very interesting and probably depressing, is that his mother, Lara Rogar, actually goes back to Essos. She actually leaves when Aegon was only about 4 years old, I believe. And so when you have this character of Aegon IV, when he was born, he was actually the third in line to the throne, because there was actually a lot of issues in terms of the succession at this time. You had Aegon III, who is the reigning king of Aegon IV's birth, but outside of that, Aegon didn't have any children yet. His wife was still too young, and at this time, Viserys was the second in line. So when Aegon was born, he was the third in line to the throne. Now, I don't think that Aegon would have been trained to rule, because again, think about it. Aegon III would have to have no sons, and then the throne would have to pass to Viserys for Aegon to be king. Now, that could have happened, right? That's not out of the, worldly possibility, but by the time Aegon would have gotten to the age where you would have started maybe training him to be a king, you already start having other characters that pop up, right? Aegon starts having sons in terms of Daeron, who we talked about in the last episode, and also then he would eventually have had Baelor. So at that point, right, Aegon just starts slipping further and further in the line of succession. So growing up, I think it would have been weird, because he would not have had a mother. He wouldn't have really had a lot of parental figures. Aegon III, I guess, could have been someone like that, but even him, he was still quite young at this point, and he's going to die, and he's not really going to like be a great ruler either. It seems like Viserys is the one really ruling. And so you kind of get to this point where you do realize why Aegon becomes the person that he does. Because Aegon is someone that indulges himself. He's a lot like Viserys in the way that he's described in Fire and Blood, or even maybe somebody like Aerys, the Mad King, because he's someone that just wants his pleasantries, right? When he's born and as he's growing up, he looks like the normal, stereotypical Targaryen. He's very handsome. He seems to have a lot of charisma. He seems to be kind of clever. He has a lot of wit, it seems like. It's how he's described anyway in the world of Ice and Fire. But he's someone that I don't think at a young age had someone teaching him how to be a man, right? He just indulges himself, whether it's on women, on wine, food, all of these things and all these characteristics are horrible for someone wanting to be king. And so when you think about Viserys at this time, his father, Viserys II, he is someone that basically ends up ruling for a number of kings. He basically is ruling for his brother Aegon, who is kind of destroyed by the things that happened during the dance. He's someone that's not very happy in life. He seems to have a little bit of happiness, and then he kind of, again, falls apart once again, and Viserys has to rule quite a lot for him. He then has to rule again once Daeron the Young Dragon goes and does his wars in Dorne. And then also when Baelor becomes king, it's also somebody that doesn't really care about ruling. He wants to be, with the faith and all these things, and he's making really bad decisions like the Maiden Vault stuff and all of that, which isn't central to this episode because, again, we're talking about mainly Aegon, but there will be a part that we'll talk about when we get there. So when you think about Viserys, I could see a situation where Viserys just didn't have a lot of time to really be being a great father to him because he was ruling the kingdoms. It's not the greatest situation. And also Aegon doesn't have a mother. So it's a weird situation, right, for Aegon growing up because he finds himself in a situation where, well, who's going to tell him no? Who's going to tell him no? And we do see Viserys step in occasionally in terms of, like, say, the women that he ends up, like, sleeping with and that are considered, like, his loves, for instance. But if you even think about it in the world of Ice and Fire, maybe this is an exaggerated number, maybe it's not, but it's said that Aegon slept with over 900 women. That's a crazy, thing to even think about, right? And so that paints the picture of who Aegon was. He was someone that was never going to sleep at night with an empty bed. And that's even to consider that he ends up marrying his sister Nerys. And the two don't seem to really be that compatible, right? Like, Nerys is kind of the opposite. And we're going to talk about this, I think, a lot in the next episode. But Nerys was somebody that was the opposite. She was very pious. She was somebody that was very religious. She follows a lot of what Baelor kind of was preaching. She was kind of around growing up with kind of more of Baelor. And when you think about all those things, that's just the opposite of Aegon. Aegon was not somebody that was pious or seemed to care much about the faith. He seemed to, take after Daeron the First, or he tried to anyway. In terms of, he didn't like Dorne and all that stuff. Daeron doesn't seem to be the most pious type of person. That's kind of where you see that split within the Targaryen family. And so even though we see that Aegon eventually marries Nerys with the blessing of Aegon III, it's not a good one, right? Because Nerys seems to have a much more tighter connection with Aemon. It gives a lot of Alyssa and Balon vibes in terms of the parents of Viserys and Daemon. They seem to have a really great relationship as being a brother and sister and then lover. And so it would be kind of like if we went with the original plan, which was, okay, let's marry, again, Balon's older brother to Alyssa, and they're not really that compatible. It would have been if that would have actually ended up happening here. And so we have this character of Aegon, who is in a marriage that he doesn't really like with Nerys, and that goes wrong right away. You kind of see the battle lines being drawn even from this marriage that happens quite early on in Aegon's life, because Nerys seems to be crying at the wedding, and it seems that Aemon and Aegon get into it about probably the bedding ceremony that occurred during this wedding. We don't have a lot of the details. It'll be really interesting to see how this whole time period changes, or we get more details if we get Fire and Blood Part 2. From an early point, we know there were a lot of issues between the three siblings in Aegon, Aemon, and Nerys. Now, what would occur from there would be interesting, because during this whole time period, even when he was married with Nerys, he has 9 lovers. And I think this is an important part to bring into the story right about now, because these are going to be important women to showing how his reign is going to go later on and how he as a king is going to uphold himself. So in 149, he gets his first mistress, the Lady Helena Stokeworth. And you even got to think about it. This happens in 149 AC. Aegon's only about 14 at the time. It really shows you how different things were going down with Aegon. He's already hooking up with women and stuff at 14, which is not surprising given his father, right, having him at 13. But with this affair, this would go for about 2 years between the two But this is what I'm talking about. Eventually, they were found by a knight of the Kingsguard, and Prince Viserys decided to marry Felaena off to the Master of Arms at the Red Keep, Sir Lucas Lothston. And also then, to get them kind of away from court, Viserys then also convinced his brother Aegon to name the Lothstons as the new Lord of Harrenhal, thereby removing Felaena from court. But however, that didn't really stop Aegon, and this would still kind of continue for 2 more years as he frequently visited Harrenhal. And it's interesting is that you think about what just happens in this first interaction. If you're in another family during this time and you're looking at, oh, okay, what just occurred here, right? Aegon has this mistress who is already sent away. It's kind of public knowledge. The rumors start to kind of go. And you see that, oh, wait, okay, this family got Harrenhal, which would have been a big boost up. They seem to get rewards for sleeping with Aegon. And maybe that wasn't the intent from Viserys, but maybe that was to kind of keep them quiet about Aegon and all of that stuff. But it already shows that Viserys kind of undermines Aegon. And the two had issues because if you're Viserys, you don't want Aegon to be going around with any type of woman, right? He's a Targaryen prince. He needs to have a good marriage, and you don't want to be doing that like outside of wedlock. So you have that part of it. And later on, we're going to see him also like cheating on Nerys, for instance. And it's interesting because like when they're sent away, right? When Lady Felaena is sent away, this happens like a little before his marriage with Nerys. So that kind of paints the picture as well as to why Aegon was married to Nerys at that certain age, because it comes right after like Felaena, right? You want to get him into a marriage to hopefully stop him from actually going around and having a bunch of bastards. And so there's a lot of things to think about here, because when Viserys becomes king, and eventually he's going to be killed and very mysterious, some people do point to the idea that maybe Aegon was the person that killed Viserys, and we'll get there when we get there, but this is something you have to keep in mind. Viserys and Aegon don't seem to have a great relationship, and it's a weird relationship to begin with because Viserys is only 13 years older than his son. It's not a very father-son type relationship. But after Felaena, next we would get Megget, or also known as Mary Meg, who was found by Prince Aegon in 155 AC. When he was in need of a smith, he basically just bought her in kind of the weirdest fashion, just like buying a mule. Very weird. As Aegon offered 7 gold dragons and a threat of Sir Joffrey Staunton of the Kingsguard, persuaded the man to let Aegon buy this woman, more or less. Not really that great. But even then, Viserys was there to thwart his son again. There seemed to be this secret ceremony that had been performed. It's kind of not really that legal, more or less. And so after 4 years of this kind of relationship going on, in 158 AC, Viserys returned Megget to her husband, who beat her to death within a year. Yeah, that is a horrible thing for a woman to kind of go through, right? You're just bought out by this guy. Basically, you're just used as a whore. And yeah, then you're just beaten when you're sent home to your husband. It's like, you're the one that gave me away. Like, it's wild. And the one thing that's a common reoccurrence with Aegon's reign and him as a person is that the women are usually the ones that suffer the most, and that is unfortunately only going to get worse from here. It does not get better. To note, though, Megget did birth Aegon 4 daughters, Alysanne, Lily, Willow, and Rosie. But yeah, none of them will truly play that big of a role in the coming events, so we're not really going to cover them too much. The third one, which was actually a connection to the first episode, when I talked about Aegon bringing back those kind of hostages or guests to King's Landing after King Daeron seemed to have taken Dorne, one of those people was Lady Castella Vaith. Prince Aegon, who was escorting her, seemed to get it on with her, more or less. And what's even more interesting, to show how Aegon just uses these women as playthings, even though the two had a relationship, it seems that Aegon had grown bored of her and just allowed her to basically be killed almost, right? Because that's what was the implication here. When Daeron is killed and Dorne seems to be lost, these hostages, which Castella is one, are sent to basically be hanged. And Aegon just gives her up like a whim. Oh, she's just another woman. I'll just find the next one. That's basically how Aegon does it. Now, that doesn't end up occurring because Baelor basically returns them to Dorne, trying to make a peace. and all of that. And yeah, now Casella did believe that Aegon, still loved her and all that, and he would send for her, but that just wasn't the case. Aegon just used her as a plaything, and when he got bored, he sent her away, more or less. That just seems pretty obvious here. And this is when we get to her fourth affair, Bellegra Othrys, the Black Pearl of Braavos. She was the captain of the Widow Wind, whom Aegon met after being sent as an envoy to Braavos in 161 AC. Now, why anybody would send Aegon as an envoy to anything is beyond me, but that tells you kind of the stupidity of Baelor. He was a terrible king, and maybe Viserys allowed this. Maybe he thought, okay, Aegon maybe could get some reputation for himself, maybe earn some honor. He didn't do so good, because this affair with the Black Pearl would actually last for 10 years. And again, I want you to put this into your mind. This is all happening while he's married to Nerys. That is just insane to think about. And yeah, it's something, if you're Nerys, where that's really got to hurt your self-confidence, just a lot of things there, and this goes on for pretty much even after her death. So it's not great. Also, just to note, Bellegra did actually give, it seems like, 3 kids to Aegon as well, and Bellinora, Narha, and Balerion. So it's, yeah, just put that into perspective as well. So again, around this time, we also see something else happen. So Dana the Defiant, and I'm sorry for naming her in the last episode. Kind of got confused with the names Daenerys and Dana. So yes, this is the sister of Baelor. Now, to begin with, she was supposed to be married to Baelor, but Baelor obviously didn't care about women. He was more worried about the faith and all that stuff. So she gets end up put in the maiden vault with her sisters. And some even believe that after Baelor's death, she should have become the queen. Now, because of the Great Council, the precedent that was set by the dance and all that stuff, that never ended up actually occurring. But it is interesting to think about, because in about 170 AC, around that time, we just know when Daemon is born, it's 170 AC. So in that time frame, you have Aegon, who actually helps, sneak her out from the maiden vault, and they seem to have a relationship, which ends up getting Dana pregnant, and she has a son named Daemon Waters. This character will be foundationally important to the rest of this story. We won't talk a ton about him because, again, in Aegon's reign, Daemon's still extremely young. Like, we don't even really see the Blackfyre Rebellion happen until years after his death. So not a lot of focus is going to be on Daemon here. But again, it is important to realize that he is born around this time. So getting into this part now, from here on, the rest of these people will be kind of his loves during his reign. So every person that I listed above here happened before he became king. And so that is really important to understand, because, yeah, now there's a different reason as to why women are coming to court and offering themselves up to Aegon. Because as you've kind of seen through some of these people, right, you're gaining a lot of status, you're gaining a lot of importance by being with Aegon. Even though you're not his true wife or have legitimate children, you're still gaining things, right? Like how we talked about with the Lostons, and they're going to actually come back up in this story, but how they get Harrenhal and all that stuff, that actually doesn't end up well for them, but still, they gain things out of it, right? And so that becomes even more prominent when Aegon becomes king. And so I'm going to run through the rest of his lovers, and then we're going to kind of get back into the story with Aegon. I just think it's important to understand some of the women he was with and their importance going forward in the story. So, Lady Barbara Bracken. And this woman is seeming like a basically straight up, okay, we want you to more or less be Aegon's paramour, right? And she was somebody that would have been familiar to Aegon as well, given that she was a companion to the other princesses in Dana, Rhaena, and Elena, the sisters of Baelor. And so he would eventually have ran into her, and that's exactly what happens in 171 AC. He ends up running into her, and, well, Aegon, when he sees something he wants, he gets it, right? He's a prince at this point. He's about to become king, and he does become king. So all of that is important. And so when Aegon eventually does become king in 172 AC, Barbara openly became his mistress. Now it wasn't even like being hidden, right? Because before this, he had to hide them. If like they were known, his father would kind of send them away. And so this is now when that is gone, right? We don't care about decency. Aegon is just kind of flaunting around his women of the day. Again, would have been incredibly harmful to Nerys, and Nerys is, getting close to the end of her life, but we'll see something that's very interesting, right? Because during this time, Aegon would actually end up naming her father to become Hand. But at the same time, she would give birth to a son that same year, 2 weeks before Queen Nerys was to give birth to a daughter. And we know that this was going to become Aegor Rivers, or other known as Bittersteel. If you're watching this video, shout out to you in the comments. You are a big fan of this series, I would assume. But yeah, this is another important birth, right? You have Bittersteel and Daemon now coming pretty close together. They'll be really important moving forward, and that's a key point of it, right? So people at this time are realizing that we can manipulate Aegon to get things, right? And it even goes as far as this, right? Where Lady Barbara Bracken, was trying to convince Aegon to basically marry her if Nerys died. And so there is a legitimate chance that if something had gone a little bit more wrong with Nerys and her birthing, that it's likely Barbara Bracken could have become the queen. Aegor Rivers then would have been the person that people would have been championing to become the next king. So you see how these little tiny things could have changed the entire story. We could have been talking about how instead Bittersteel was the person that was being put on the crown, and Daemon Blackfyre being the one to back him. That could have been very interesting as well. But eventually, Barbara Bracken would be kind of sent away as Prince Aemon forced Aegon to send her away. Again, Aegon's still not completely out of the water, right? He still has to contest with his brother Aemon, who has the love of the people. He is someone that I think Aegon would have feared at this point because of his relationship with Nerys. So we don't really get to see like him actually living out his power until both Nerys and Aemon die, which they'll happen pretty close together. But after this, we finally get one of his companions that most people like in terms of Aegon's court. We get Melissa Blackwood. Very funny that a Blackwood comes directly after a Bracken, because we also see kind of some political maneuvering going on as well, because Lady Barbara Bracken also had been given land for the Brackens, and they became known as Barbara's Teats. And eventually, when Melissa Blackwood became the next mistress of Aegon, though that would switch again. Those lands would go back to the Blackwoods. The Blackwoods would actually gain a lot of influence. And Melissa was kind of a kind girl. She was somebody that people really liked. She's a stereotypical, the Blackwoods are the good guys type of situation, who she befriended Queen Nerys, Prince Daeron, and Aemon. She reigned again for 5 years as Aegon's mistress, but before being set aside. Now, interesting to think about, right? Think about that dynamic, right? Nerys, who, is married to Aegon, the king, and you're befriending the woman that's seducing him. It's a very weird dynamic, but it kind of shows how likable Melissa Blackwood must have been. But this is where the story gets even more messed up, because Lady Bethany Bracken, who was the younger sister of Barbara, had basically been trained on how to seduce Aegon. Could you imagine like that conversation and the things that are going on there, right? Like Barbara just being, oh yeah, like Aegon likes it this way, and he likes when you do this and do that. Like, could you think about that from sister to sister? But either way, she caught Aegon's eye in 177 AC. And also something to note, I kind of skipped over this, but also Melissa Blackwood would give more children to Aegon in Maya Rivers, Gwyneth Rivers, and Brynden Rivers in 175 AC, who would later be known as Bloodraven. And we'll definitely be talking about him in the future, but another important bastard that came a little bit later, again, separated by 3 years from Bittersteel to Bloodraven. So we'll talk about him in the future as well. But Bethany Bracken did not come to a good end, right? She was not really good with this relationship. She wasn't really comfortable with it. And eventually, she found comfort in the arms of Sir Torrance Toyne of the Kingsguard. But once again, it's kind of, King's Landing. It gets around. And so the Aegon would become aware of this. He had Terrance tortured to death and had Bethany and her father executed. Again, a lot of the times, the women who are kind of, it seems like, the innocents in these situations, they get the raw end of the deal. But that would not end Aegon's mistresses. But unfortunately for this story, it gets even more messed up, because depending on what theory you believe, personally, I believe that Lady Jane Austen was the daughter of Aegon and Felaena Stokeworth, his first mistress. Can you imagine how messed up that is? Jane, I believe, was only about 14 at the time, so she's already extremely young. And also, she could have possibly been your daughter. It wasn't great, but this ends up happening in 170 AC, again, in the same year that everything kind of goes down with the Brackens. But she was not long for Aegon's mistress. She caught a disease or infection, more or less, from Aegon, which he had caught from a whore he had seen since Lady Bethany's death. Jane and her family were then sent away from court quickly after this. And then we would get to the final mistress of the official ones, the ones we know of, in Serene of Lys, which was an extremely different woman than we are used to seeing with Aegon. A lot of these women that Aegon's had in the past had been kind of ladies of, pretty prominent houses within Westeros, but not this one. As Lord John Hightower, who had become the newest hand for Aegon, he had brought Serene of Lys with him. And she was a woman that would, do all the classic things they talk about with powerful women, right? That they were bathing in virgin's blood and stuff all like that. And yeah. But we do end up seeing that she gives birth to Aegon's final major bastard, Shiera Seastar. And so that is all of his major mistresses. Those are kind of the players. But so going back to after their marriage and their wedding, we would end up seeing the birth of Daeron II by Daenerys at the end of the year when they were married. Again, prominent figure, important to know, but after this point, there would be some issues. And again, we can really see Daenerys, how frail she was, how hard it was for her to have children after she lost twins in the past during this time period. Eventually, though, in 172 AC, again, almost 20 years after Daeron had been born, she would give birth to Princess Daenerys. Now, the boy would be stillborn, but Princess Daenerys would be very important in the coming future, as she was someone that Daemon Blackfyre actually seemed to be in love with. But that's kind of a tale for another day, as we'll probably talk about more of her, I think, in the Daemon Blackfyre video. But I think for now, we're kind of going to leave it there. And so this kind of gets us to the point of, one, Daeron's marriage. So Daeron, again, we're talking about Aegon's first son with Daenerys, actually ends up marrying Miriam Martell, also around 170 AC. A couple things happen here that are very key to understand, because this is really the thing that kind of brings the Dornish into the realm, more or less. But important also to note is that Daeron ends up kind of marrying Miriam Martell to kind of fix all the wounds going between the Dornish and Westeros. But that wasn't going to end here. When we get into Aegon IV's reign, that is going to be very important to understanding. But again, I want you guys to understand, based on the first video, I talk about this a lot, the Dornish and the people of Westeros, especially the Marsher Lords, the Stormlands, the Reach, they are going to feel very antagonistic towards the Dornish. And that's important to understand when we go into Aegon's reign. But let's not get into that yet, because we still have Baelor on the throne. Now, Baelor is someone that ends up dying because of Daemon Waters' birth, right? Because his sister, who is supposed to be so pious, that's why she's in the Maiden Vault, she has a kid out of wedlock. That's a huge sin, and so that turns Baelor to fasting and all this stuff. And some believe that Viserys may have sped along that process because he wanted to be king or all this stuff, and I don't believe that for a second, just based on the fact that Baelor wasn't eating. So, obviously, he's going to die at some point if he's not eating or drinking for days and days and days. So, Baelor dies. Now Viserys takes the throne. He's somebody that's been ruling more or less for almost his entire life, basically, and he comes to the throne. Now, he only rules for 1 year. And people seem to be conflicted on how he was as a ruler. He was very shrewd, but at the same time, a lot of people thought that maybe he could have been a Jaehaerys if he'd been able to rule for longer. And there's no real evidence of him actually having physical illnesses or things that affected him. But all of a sudden, he fell quite ill and died in 172 AC. Now, the maesters, especially in the world of Ice and Fire, are conflicted on Viserys' actual death. Some seem to implicate that it was Viserys himself after, again, having conflicts with his father. It's also said that he seemed to want the throne even from an early age, that he sped along the process and killed his father. Now, I don't believe that to be the case for a couple reasons. One, Aegon IV, up to this point, has not showed himself to be someone that's very politically savvy. He hasn't shown himself to be clever in terms of like moving up the ladder. He doesn't seem like somebody that would be that brave to even pull off something like that, poisoning his own father, regardless of their issues. And you also think about how Aegon goes forward in early parts of his reign, right? He's still kind of afraid of Aemon. He doesn't start like doing this whole idea that Daeron is a bastard until after Aemon's actually dead. He kind of just plays with it. Like he lets the rumor get out, but he doesn't start publicly like kind of saying anything like that until after Aemon's death. And so when we look at this idea of Viserys' death, I think it's likely that it still was a poisoning. Now, whether you want to say that was the maesters that did it, I don't necessarily put this one on the maesters. I put this on if you're somebody and you're a lord and you see what's coming. Poisoning Viserys makes a lot of sense because you then can try and get favor with somebody that's much more corruptible that you could easily, use for your own gain and trying to elevate your power, your house's power. We see this with the Brackens. We see this with the Blackwoods. We see this with the Lostons. It makes a lot of sense if you think about it. If you're somebody that's trying to gain things, like think about if you're a Littlefinger type character and you see the king that's on the throne right now, Viserys, who by all accounts is going to be a great ruler. You don't have like a great way of being able to maneuver. All right. It's like something like Stannis, for instance. If Stannis is king, not a lot of ways you can maneuver and play that Game of Thrones if you're Littlefinger. Whereas like if Joffrey is king, there's a lot of ways that you can manipulate that situation. The same applies here. So I don't have a defined answer of who poisoned Viserys, but I don't think it's Aegon. I think it's people that wanted to use Aegon because they knew he was going to become king and who he was as a person. But regardless, when Aegon then becomes king, everything seems to kind of change. A lot of people come to court just because of their flattering Aegon or offering up their daughters for him. Everybody was looking to manipulate and use him. And you see the factions start to develop. On one side, you have Prince Daeron, the heir to the Iron Throne, Nerys, his mother, and also his uncle and Prince Aemon. That side starts to kind of start. So if you think about it, right, you kind of have what the greens and the blacks are for the dance. You start to have, I'd say like the Dornish faction, which is kind of where you're going to go with. The main power base for Daeron was Dorne. And then you have kind of the Aegon faction, which would have been like Daemon Blackfyre and whatever support he was going to gather as well. So you kind of had a split court, right? Where nobody was really willing to talk against him outside of like Aemon and Daeron. And this got so bad that he was even having like brothels prepared for him. He was just somebody that if he saw a woman in the crowd, he would just take her. He was a disgusting, horrible king, just in general. He was someone that was corrupt, as he would take things away from, certain houses and give it to others. For instance, we see this story of the death of Lord Ossifer Plum. Seems like all his wealth and inheritance would then go to others. So we saw this person of Aegon being used by people around his court. It was basically a competition to make who can make Aegon the happiest, and you would get rewards. That's kind of how it seemed to go. And that's why I kind of think Viserys was killed by somebody not named Aegon. But even we would need to see even more repercussions as to what would happen. You would think some things like ancestral, things like dragon eggs, which would be extremely rare at this time of Aegon's reign, right? There are no dragons by the time of Aegon's reign. He gives away a dragon egg to Lord Butterwell for just some women, for a one-night stand, more or less. That egg then is going to cause an issue, which we'll see in the Dunk and Egg novellas that pops up there. But Aegon is so stupid. It shows that he has a utter lack of care for things like dragon eggs, things that are super important to the Targaryen dynasty, right? Those are treasures of their history. So it seems that Aegon just didn't really have a care for things like that. And that's going to really play up to this idea, like when we get to when the idea of Aegon giving Blackfyre to Daemon, what was the motivation behind that? Or were there just things that all were going into it outside of just maybe Aegon wanting Daemon to be seen as his heir, more or less? But even something even more detrimental that we see with Aegon's reign and, you know, his wife, Nerys, women just being in terrible situations because of Aegon. Nerys was somebody that should not have been having children. She was somebody that was too frail. She was barely struggling with the birthing that she had done. Again, remember when I talked about earlier on, it seemed like she was going to die, and that's why Aegor may have been the heir for a second there if things had gone differently. But after that, the maesters straight up tell Aegon, if you keep doing this and trying to get her pregnant, she's going to die. Well, guess what ends up happening? Aegon, who Nerys says, you know, let's just be brother and sister, he goes right against that. He says, no, we're going to keep being brother and sister, and he's going to keep having his way with her. And that's going to lead to her death eventually. And that's why when you even look at like Aegon and Aemon's, you know, conflict, it's almost completely driven by this idea of Aemon and Nerys' love, whether that was, you know, more than just brother and sister or whatnot. Still, that was the driving issue that was occurring at this time. But not only was their relationship deteriorating, Aegon himself was allowing rumors to go by that Nerys and Aemon were the real parents of Daeron, that he was truly a bastard because he just didn't like Daeron. And that pops up when we get to this event with Sir Morgul Hastwyck basically accusing Nerys of adultery and treason. Could you imagine Aegon sitting here allowing that to be spread about his wife and sister? He does nothing. He allows it to happen. He allows this rumor to spread, which Prince Aemon has to step up and defend his sister's honor in a trial by combat, in which, of course, he wins because he's Aemon the Dragon Knight. And this is kind of a driving point, right? Because, okay, if you look at it from a god's perspective and how you view trial by combats, this should prove that Daeron wasn't a bastard, but that doesn't particularly matter in terms of the case of why Daemon should be king later on. It is part of it, and they will use that as part of their campaign, that Daeron's a bastard, but never really mattered if he was a bastard. It was all about who was the true Targaryen, who Aegon truly wanted to succeed him. That's what a lot of the Blackfyre argument is going to be built upon. And what's even more interesting is if you think about it, Aegon's daughter Daenerys never had any of these things, right? There was never any idea that, you know, maybe Aegon wasn't the father of Daenerys. That never sprung up, only with Daeron, which kind of seems to prove the point that Daeron probably was Aegon's, just built upon this fact that, like, okay, it's made apparent for one child, but not the other. And it also pops up as soon as Daeron and Aegon start quarreling. Because remember, Daeron's wife is a Martell. The Dornish, at this point, seem to be, again, married into the throne. But if you think about it, when Aegon dies, well, if Daeron is his true heir, the Dornish now sit the throne. And we talked about in the first episode, and we talked about a little bit in this episode as well, Aegon doesn't like the Dornish. He probably looked up to Daeron the First quite a lot. He was someone that was there during the conquest of Dorne. He would have seen the horrors going on there. He is someone that probably didn't like the idea of the Martells being able to claim power within Westeros, the ultimate seat, having Miriam Martell be the queen of Westeros after Aegon died. And this prompts Aegon to start to kind of figure out how we're going to get rid of Daeron. You can't publicly, you know, say, okay, Daeron, you're not my heir, and I'm going to give it to Daemon. Now, at the time, Daemon was still extremely young as well. Remember, Daemon's only about 4 or 5 when all these things are going on, right? And so we end up seeing Aegon try to launch an invasion of Dorne while his son, the heir, is married into the Martells. And this fleet ends up going nowhere, right? A storm brushes them away. again, even Aegon tries later trying to build these dragons with wildfire. That burns down a quarter of the Kingswood. Like, Aegon is just an incompetent person when in terms of executing plans. And that's why I feel like he definitely didn't poison Viserys, but he is just somebody that's so stupid. You understand the rationale, right? The rationale was, okay, if we can break the Dornish and, get rid of them and break their power, well, Daeron, his son, doesn't really have any other power backing him fully. The Dornish was his power. So that's the idea, right? You take away his power. You don't exactly unname him as heir until Daemon gets older, and also when Daeron has less backing, right? You wait for people like Aemon to die off and all that stuff. But that is key to understanding all of this. But even after this, when we get back to, for instance, when Terrence Toyne is killed, we see how this gets even further, because Terrence Toyne's brothers desired revenge. And the only thing that saved Aegon's life as they planned kind of an assassination attempt was Prince Aemon. And Prince Aemon the Dragon Knight, for all the nobility and honorable guy that he seems to be, people praise him. He dies protecting one of the worst Targaryen kings, and his brother who hated him, he died in this assassination attempt to the Toyne brothers, a result of directly because of Aegon's actions. But even then, also, I think I misspoke earlier when I said that Nerys dies before Aemon. It's actually the opposite. Sorry if I said that and I didn't cut it out, but at this point, we would then see Nerys, who would also die in childbirth a year later, exactly because of Aegon's actions. Aegon is directly responsible for the things that happened to both Aemon and Nerys. And so now Daeron is alone. Daeron does not have, the backing of his uncle or the backing of the queen. It's now really him versus his father. And now, the thing that was holding Aegon back this whole time from making moves to try and get rid of Daeron as the heir, they're gone. Aemon was the thing holding that back. So now Aegon can maybe make sly comments. He can publicly kind of maybe denounce Daeron. Well, even what we see following this kind of points to that idea. But we see that once Daemon, who at 12 years old won a squire's tourney. Remember, a squire's tourney. We're not talking about a big tournament. I mean, this is a squire tourney. When Daemon and Blackfyre, or Daemon Waters at the time, but he's going to be Daemon Blackfyre, wins this, Aegon publicly knighted him, making him the youngest to be knighted since Maegor the Cruel. And he gave him the sword, Blackfyre, the ancestral sword. And this is just a huge moment, because before this, the sword maybe wasn't as valuable in terms of, legitimacy, because the dragons were kind of seen as that thing of power and who could be the person. If you think about even Maegor the Cruel, like, yes, he had Blackfyre, and that was part of the reason why people believe maybe he should have been king. It was more because he had Balerion, and he looked more like Aegon. He was strong, but Blackfyre just helped that. Well, now that the dragons are gone, Blackfyre becomes a huge, huge, huge relic of legitimacy. And so Aegon giving him that seems to show that Aegon wanted Daemon to become king. Now, is it that, or is it this idea that Aegon doesn't really care about family relics, right? He gives a dragon egg away just so he can have sex with a couple of women on one night. Part of it is Aegon wants Daemon to be recognized as his legitimate son. And I think part of it is also he doesn't actually realize how much Blackfyre is a value to this family. And so I think it's a kind of a combination of things, because we kind of have this foreshadowed in an earlier moment. But this moment would mark the moment where Daemon would be seen as kind of almost a legitimate threat to Daeron's claim as he went further into Daeron's reign after his father's. But Aegon would go even further. Not only would Aegon give him the sword, he also looked to make a match for him as well. And this is where I think Aegon made a misstep. I think Aegon was thinking very short term, not very long term, and it shows kind of another blunder, because Aegon was still thinking about, how do I invade Dorne, again, and try to take it, finish Daeron the First's work. And so he marries Daemon to the daughter of the Archon of Tyrosh, a girl named Rohan. Now, this at this time was not Daemon's wish. Daemon did not want this. He wanted to be married to Daenerys, which actually would have been a much better match. If you think about it, if you're Aegon and you say marry your daughter to Daemon, that would have made Daemon have so much more legitimacy. It's kind of like the idea of why Rhaenyra in The Dance marries Daemon. It gives her a lot more legitimacy because you tie your claims together. It's kind of the same idea here. Like, I think there's a bunch of better like marriages that would have worked for Daemon, because what you needed to do if you were going to try and make him the legitimate heir before you died, and I don't think Aegon was thinking like this. I think Aegon thought he was going to live longer to eventually take out Dorne, take out Daeron's source of power, is he should have probably married him to any of the major houses in Westeros. That's the one thing that Daeron didn't have during the Blackfyre Rebellion. He didn't have any of the major houses backing him. He had a lot of the secondary third houses. If he was able to have, say, a Tyrell married to him, or he had, a Baratheon married to him, or whatever, there would have been a lot more like power that he could have had. He would have had more of a place of power, right? A place where he could retreat to and all those things. And so marrying him to Tyrosh gave, Aegon a fleet. It gave Daemon a fleet, but that didn't matter in terms of the Westerosi politics. It was being used as, okay, this is another fleet to kind of take over Dorne later on. It was very short-sighted. And I think the one thing that kind of screws over Daemon is this marriage that really ruined, I think, a lot of his chances to have more potential allies. But with that being said, there also are other sources that are cited that, like, Daemon, we're not clear on how Rohan, like how he was on his thoughts about marrying Rohan. I do think he wouldn't have been happy about it because he seems to like Princess Daenerys much more, but I don't think that was a good match. But other sources seem to claim that Aegon IV was maybe promising Daemon that he was going to be able to marry more than one wife, similar to like Maegor or Aegon before him. But I don't know like that how that would have gone. Like, that hadn't happened for the Targaryens in a very long time. I think that's really not a good way to go about it. Daemon, you can't blame him if that's what he did think, so maybe he was okay with it because he's so young at this point. But I think kind of a weird decision. And even, like, this didn't really go well anyway, because Daeron would thwart this, right? He would make sure that Daemon married Rohan, which made a lot of sense. Like, if you're Daeron, you want that marriage to go through. And so we would see in the last few years, it would kind of be a power struggle between Aegon and Daeron, who Daeron would almost publicly always oppose him on whatever he was doing. The two would get into fights all of the time. But the question is, why at no point does Aegon ever unname Daeron his heir? And it's, again, quite clear. I've tried to paint that picture, especially in the second half of the video. If he did that, that would have caused a civil war. And so he doesn't do that. So I think Aegon is kind of smart. If he's trying to get Daemon to become the heir, he needs to do it where it's not going to create such a civil war that there's a chance he could lose it, right? Like, you want to paint a situation in which Daemon comes into the throne and Daeron has no backing, so he can't oppose it. He has no power. He has no leverage. But Daeron did have those things at this time, and that's prevalent how we're going to see in the Blackfyre Rebellion as well. But eventually, this would lead to his death in 184 AC. At only 49 years of age, Aegon had become someone that was fat, disgusting looking, and he was someone that couldn't even really walk anymore. And that's the weirdest part, right? Because how does this man get a woman pregnant, as we end up seeing with Shiera Seastar? Like, she ends up being born, even when at this time, when Aegon was such in a bad condition. How did that even happen? But even when Aegon died, his bloated body was so swollen that he could not lift himself from his couch, that he became covered in his feces. Aegon's limbs were rotting and crawling in hosts of flesh worms. Is this some sort of disease we're seeing with the Targaryens? We saw something like this earlier on with one of Jaehaerys' children, where she came back and her death was also extremely brutal. But it's not made clear. Did Shiera's mother have something to do with it? As Serene was kind of known as like a sorceress type, was that possible? Maybe. We don't know. Maybe it was just the gods cursing Aegon. That also could have been possible. But the Maesters didn't know anything about it. They didn't know how this could have occurred. But he was given the milk of the poppy to try and dull the pain, but nothing else could be done. and Aegon, giving one last fuck you to the rest of Westeros, as you guys all know, decreed that all of his bastards be recognized and legitimate. This would create conflict for the Targaryens for generations. And we're not going to talk about really the after events of this for a couple videos, because I think there's still more that needs to be explored before we get to that point. Talking about specifically Aegor, talking about Daemon, talking about Nerys, and also Aemon. There's a lot to talk about before we really get into, Daeron's rule, because we'll probably do his last before we start to really get into the events that occurred during the Blackfyre Rebellion. But this is that moment, right? Because I think if you're Aegon, I think your rationale here is you can't name, Daemon to be your heir, because that would create a lot of issues. And Daemon at this time was still too young to fight that civil war. But give him a leg up, right? Give Daemon to at least be legitimized so that he's not a bastard, so that he can carry the Targaryen name if he kind of wants. But that's it. Aegon can't do any more than that. He can create the seeds for the wars to come, but he can't exactly enact them out. He can't guarantee that Daemon will become his successor. But thank you guys all for watching. This is a incredibly long one, especially for just one of these part videos. But there's a lot to talk about with Aegon IV. He is pretty much the main character in terms of the Blackfyre Rebellion, at least the first one. And so you have to talk about a lot of it. There's a lot of details there. It's hard to match up the timeline of when things happen. Myself, I really praise a lot of other creators that are able to get this information and put it into a functioning timeline, because there's just so much going on. If you even look at the wiki, which I kind of used for some of the information in this video, I took a lot from the book, The World of Ice and Fire. It's hard to match up these details because even the wiki doesn't have them in a timeline order, and some things they actually don't even have. The website's actually not that great for the information on Aegon IV. But yeah, just a lot of stuff. I hope it wasn't overwhelming to kind of watch. Hopefully this kind of came off normally as how this information could be done the best I could. But I hope you guys all enjoyed basically an hour-long video, and I'll see you guys in the next part, which will be about Nerys and Prince Aemon.